Everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. I hope you're doing well. We've made it to the end. We're in the final week of Here Lies Herodotus. We're closing out the Histories of Herodotus with books 8 and 9 this week. This is part 5. And I hope you've been having fun. I hope you've enjoyed it. I have just been absolutely delighted this month with rereading this book. As I mentioned in other videos, I love this book. I've read it more than once, all the way through. And I always think, okay, as sort of a hyperactive free associator, personally, I love the digressions, I love the weird tangents, but then the boy in me gets to the end of the book when the Greco-Persian Wars are in full swing, especially in books sort of like 7, 8, and 9, when we have Thermopylae, and then Salamis in book 8, and Platia in book 9. And I go, yeah, but I really like that part too. So it's hard for me to pick like a favorite part or a favorite book within the histories, but I've had a huge amount of fun. Thank you to those of you who've been like putting in questions or comments or emails. It's been a really fun experience for me, and I hope it has been for you as well. So thank you. As I mentioned, we're in books 8 and 9 this week, and so if you thought that Herodotus is sort of just all over the place, he devotes 2 whole books to Egypt. Early on, he devotes most of a book to the Scythians, and he's just sort of all over the place. And then suddenly, and then if you remember, for the Battle of Marathon, there's like a page and a half, and then Thermopylae expands, and then in books 8 and 9, we really get a sort of zoom-in focus to some critical events in the Greco-Persian Wars. And it's clear to me at least, what Herodotus feels is, in his mind, sort of the greatest Greek triumph of the Greco-Persian Wars. And that's the Battle of Plataea, not the Battle of Salamis. Despite sort of historians arguing that the Battle of Salamis is the critical one, that's the one that saved, Athenian democracy and saved the Greek world from Persia, saved all of Europe from Persia. And maybe, it certainly, it was a massive turning point in the war. Herodotus, in his writing, is going to sort of favor Platia. We'll see, but it's a great end to a great book, in my opinion. So book 8 picks up kind of right on the same day as Thermopylae. So while we ended with the Persians do end up flanking the Spartans and their allies, the Spartans, along with King Leonidas, are killed. Many Persians have been killed, numerous Greek allies have been killed, but the Persian army is advancing. They're advancing south now. Now, parallel to that little pass at Thermopylae, there were the Straits of Aramision, which is where the Greek navy was, gathered, and the Persian navy was gathered. And the Persians, they do fight a battle, and it's really sort of it's a fight to a standstill, but it's a moral victory for the Greeks. And if you recall, during the Ionian Revolt, what precedes the final collapse of that Ionian Revolt is when the Ionian navy, with some Greek help, sort of disintegrates, and they sort of backpedal and flee when when the two navies come into contact. And so to have a battle where the Greek navy fights the Persian navy to a standstill, specifically like the Phoenicians are there, the Egyptians, those triremes from Sidon that won the boat races, the Greeks fight them to a standstill, and that's a huge moral victory for the Greeks. It shows that the emphasis on building a navy, Themistocles' idea, Simon's compromise with sort of the more aristocratic factions from Athens to support a navy, was not misguided. But because the Persian army is now advancing, the Greek navy also has to sort of retreat and figure out, where are they going to make their stand? Is it going to be at divine Salamis, as the Oracle of Delphi had suggested, and Themistocles is rooting for, or will it be farther south on the Peloponnesian peninsula? And that's important to sort of have some level of understanding of the geography for this sort of phase of the Greco-Persian Wars. So if you've ever seen the maps of Greece, there's sort of that southern peninsula that looks almost like 3 fingers. That's the Peloponnesian Peninsula. Sparta's there, Argos is there, I believe Mycenae is there, which was basically nothing at the time, but was very important in the Bronze Age. And Corinth is there as well. And so that's the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and there's a tiny isthmus, and then there's sort of the rest of Greece. So Athens, Thebes, Boeotia, and then if you go farther north, you have Thessaly and Macedonia and all of those areas. So the Persians are advancing south, and there's this sense of, okay, we have to make a stand at the isthmus now. Like, like wall off the isthmus, guard the Peloponnese. Everything north of that is just abandoned. And that becomes a question. Should the navy sort of pull all the way back and just try to defend the isthmus, defend that Peloponnesian peninsula, or should they make a stand farther north? And there's this great question around, well, if we keep backpedaling, eventually everybody's just going to want to kind of go guard their corner, and you're never going to get all these ships back together again. You're not going to get 300 ships back together. You're not going to get 100 ships back together to try and fight the Persian navy. And Herodotus reveals how closely he relies on Athenian sources when he has someone else make the argument to Themistocles, and then Themistocles goes and makes the argument to the Spartan, admiral who's like in command of the fleet. That was likely the story in Athens. It is more likely that Themistocles was kind of manipulating and running the show from behind the scenes the entire time. Herodotus does not mention this, even though it had happened within his lifetime for him to be aware of it, but he doesn't mention it within the narrative. But Themistocles, despite all his victories, later ends up being ostracized and disgraced. And so people in Athens didn't necessarily like him, and they kind of like rip his reputation. This is likely like some anti-Themistocles Athenian propaganda that Herodotus just takes. It's arguably one of the bigger like lies Herodotus makes that he could have actually checked out from some like actual first-hand sources. But they do persuade the Greek navy to stay at Salamis, and that gives time as well to evacuate Athens and evacuate good portions of them to Salamis, actually the island of Salamis, as the Persians come down and proceed to burn Athens and burn the Acropolis and really wreak havoc. And it should be noted, it was a big deal to go in and burn, a city, totally sack city. The Persians did that. They would enslave whole populations. But there's also that level, and Herodotus kind of makes a point of this, you invite a different level of vengeance if you go and proceed to like burn their temples and, desecrate their temples. That becomes like this you've now not just offended these people, but you've maybe offended, the gods, and they're going to be out for you now too. And the Persians are very arrogant to do this. Well, having done that, we now move into the actual like naval engagement, and of course, Themistocles has to do some shenanigans again. But before that, we get this really interesting like council of war from Xerxes, where it says, "What should we do?" And the only person who says, "Don't fight a naval battle," is Artemisia, the queen, who was sort of mentioned as like this woman who fights like a man. And we see some, the misogyny of antiquity popping up, particularly in Book 9 with the worst insult to a Persian. But Artemisia says, "Why are we doing this? Like, just use your army, they can't hold out much longer, just use your army. Don't lose this sea battle." But Xerxes goes, "Oh, that's great advice, but I'm gonna go with the majority. We're gonna do this." And he also has this idea that the Persians maybe, and the Persian slaves didn't win at the Straits of Aramision because he wasn't there. So he wasn't personally there as the great king to like scare them into, fighting really hard for him. But he's going to be there this time, and, legendarily, he has this throne at the cliffside overseeing the Straits of Salamis to see the entire sea battle. So as there's going to be a, maybe we finally should retreat, Themistocles continues to just do his shenanigans, and he sends this person across in a boat to say, "Hey, they're gonna escape. If you wanna keep them from escaping, you better like close off the exits." And so the Persian navy, "I'm on your side, guys. I'm on your side." And so the Persian navy moves in and extends its line to close off, so that the Greeks have no choice but to fight. When they do go out now, we have this bit where they're like back rowing, and then they get frightened. Maybe they're mocked. It does seem that there may have been some strategy to it, because as they pull back, the Persian line that was surrounding them begins to move forward, and they manage to sort of get some ships to move forward. And the whole thing with, this is a sea battle before there's any gunpowder or anything, so there aren't cannons to like shoot out a ship and sink it, or a destroyer or a battleship later on. And there's certainly not aircraft carriers with planes. The whole way a ship was sunk back then was you had to get it by the side and ram it and row into it and ram it, sort of the unprotected side of the ship. Or you could somehow, later on the Byzantines would have Greek fires, you could burn it down. Or if you got close enough, there might be troops on board who could board it and capture the ship and take it that way. But most frequently they just rowed into the side of another ship. Well, potentially like pulling back expose the Persian navy in some ways. The Greeks do find success. They find huge amounts of success. The Phoenician navy, like the best of the Persian navy, really didn't do well. They were some of the first ships to be sunk, and that of course made Xerxes furious. Artemisia, we have this great bit about where she realizes her ship's about to be hit, and so she orders them to just ram that ship. We have to escape. And Xerxes knows her ship, and so he just sees, look at that, that's who's fighting. Where's everybody else? And I think it's important to recall, as the Persian navy is defeated at Salamis, and that really ends any chance they would have of being able to go in and flank the isthmus and just land troops in the Peloponnesian Peninsula or threaten the cities there and cause the troops to pull back so that their army can advance south. And now, without a navy, the Greeks could go up and destroy that bridge at the Hellespont. As all of this happens, it's happening right before Xerxes, and it's happening in a sea. And if you recall, he had whipped the sea because nobody worships it, nobody sacrifices to it, and who does the sea think it is to wreck his bridge? Well, now it hasn't wrecked his bridge. His navy's gone. There's the hubris has come full circle. In the aftermath of that, there is of course this deep fear that that pontoon bridge at the Hellespont is going to be destroyed. So Xerxes begins a retreat, but Mardonius, his kinsman, who once is convinced that the Persian army can still defeat the Greeks, manages to persuade him to leave a fairly sizable force there in Greece under the command of Mardonius to try and be successful. And he dismisses large numbers of allies, and it's the Persians are going to stay, the Medes are going to stay, the crack troops are going to stay under the command of Mardonius, the cavalry's going to stay, and they're going to finish this. They're going to go back down and they're going to finish this. But Xerxes does retreat. And we have we then get the Greeks giving out their awards, and there was the aside about how if the Persians had known that the Greeks would compete for an olive wreath, they never would have gone to war with them, because they're they all they care about is their honor. Who are these guys? They don't want rewards, they just want their honor. And famously, of course, Athens does not get the award as the top city at the Battle of Salamis. Nobody liked him. Themistocles gets the award for the second best, hero of the Battle of Salamis. And so we start to see some of the jealousy that ultimately, is going to plague the Greek city-states for the next centuries, plural. But there is this really, I think, poignant moment where Sparta defeats Themistocles. They give him, when we read it, they give him the honors of a king sort of for a day. So he's fed extra portions, which was something that the Spartan kings get. And then when he goes home, they send how many people in an honor guard? 300. The same number of Spartans as, fought with King Leonidas at the Battle of Thermopylae. So there is this sweet, poignant moment where it's Sparta that gives this, honor to Themistocles, not his home city, not the Greek, confederation as a whole. We then get one of the last weird tangents from Herodotus, and it involves how the Macedonian royal house came to be, involving Perdiccas and scratching around the sunlight on the floor and gathering the sunlight up in his cloak. Perdiccas, incidentally, the most famous Perdiccas of antiquity, would be the great friend of Alexander the Great, a century and a half later, who, after Alexander's death, becomes the supreme commander of the Macedonian army, and is sort of like a pseudo-regent, because Alexander's younger brother was disabled, and his son, he predeceased the son he had by Roxana, so Perdiccas is sort of this regent ruler. He does not end up replacing Alexander, as the ruler of this great empire. So we get that, and we have Alexander of Macedon showing up and offering, the terms Mardonius is going to give. Look, you can't win this. Let's figure out a deal. Let's cut a deal. And Sparta, of course, shows up and says, "Whoa, counteroffer! You can't do this, Athens. Don't abandon us." And then there's this brilliant declaration of Athenian freedom. And I do want to read it. It's one of the, I think, heights of the book in terms of de Selencourt's translation. No doubt it was natural that the Lacedaemonians should dread the possibility of our making terms with Persia. Nonetheless, it shows a poor estimate of the spirit of Athens. There is not so much gold in the world, nor land so fair that we would take it for pay to join the common enemy and bring Greece into subjection. There are many compelling reasons against our doing so, even if we wished. The first and greatest is the burning of temples and images of our gods, now ashes and rubble. It is our bounden duty to avenge this desecration with all our might, not to clasp the hand that wrought it. Again, there is the Greek nation, the community of blood and language, temples and ritual, and our common customs. If Athens were to betray all this, it would not be well done. We would have you know, therefore, if you did not know it already, that so long as a single Athenian remains alive, we will make no peace with Xerxes. We are deeply moved, however, by your kindness and thoughtfulness, and the offer you made to provide for our families in this time of distress. Nothing could be more generous. Nevertheless, we prefer to carry on as best we can, without being a burden to you. That being our resolve, get your army into the field with the least possible delay. For unless we are much mistaken, it will not be long before the enemy invades Attica. He will do it at the instant he gets the news that we refuse his requests. Now, therefore, before he can appear in Attica, it is time for us to meet him in Boeotia. And so we have just this astonishing, once again, this idea Herodotus presents, which is it is better to, to fight for this freedom and to preserve this freedom, no matter what, regardless of the luxury and the pleasure and the ease that comes with the yoke of Persian rule and what they regard as Persian slavery. And, it's really beautiful. It is also highly ironic that Herodotus puts this in the mouths of the Athenians as he's writing this book during the Peloponnesian War, when Athens is doing precisely all of those things, after demanding everybody in their Delian League alliance, who can't contribute ships to defend against the Persian threat, to send money to Athens. And if they don't, then Athens will invade. So there's some deep irony that Herodotus is presenting this heroic, paean to freedom in real life, as Athens is doing just that. So that's how we end Book 8, stirring, rousing. And Book 9 begins. And Book 9, this is what reveals that Herodotus really believes the Battle of Plataea is the great Greek triumph over the Persians. It is, in a sense, sort of the last major battle of the Greco-Persian Wars. It's the one that ends a real threat of Persia being able to invade and take over Greece. Again, many historians argue for Salamis, but Herodotus, if you just look at the detail of the battle and compare it to any other one, Salamis, Thermopylae, Marathon, any of the others, this is the one that he really feels is critical. And so Mardonius invades again, Athens evacuates, they send word to Sparta. Sparta's got another religious festival going on. Has this happened before? Marathon, Thermopylae, Sparta prevaricates, eventually they send hoplites. And then they go, oh, our army's already in the field. The armies meet near Platia. Neither one really wants to attack. The Persian cavalry, is probably the most engaged of the Persian units. Their cavalry commander is killed. he has like the special gold armor, and they finally realize it and stab him in the eye. But when it comes time for the final like decisive battle, there's this hilarious like day before where the Spartans and Athenians talk, and they realize, you fought them at Marathon, and we, no Spartans survived Thermopylae except Aristodemus. We don't really have experience with them. Maybe you should fight the Persians and we'll be on the other side. And so they keep like switching flanks because the Persians are shadowing the Spartans and taunting them about like, oh, you're running away from us. You're running. We heard you were so brave. We heard you were so great. We then get this moment where we have Alexander of Macedon showing up again and like secretly warning the Greeks at night, hey, only tell Pausanias, the regent for Sparta, Leonidas is, his nephew, his nephew, saying, hey, like, they're coming, the attack's coming. Remember me, I'm your ally. And all these guys. But when they attack, the Greeks have begun this retreat because they need water. And so you have the Athenians and the Spartans on two wings. I guess it's like this for you guys. And so the Greek center has fallen back. And so when the Persians begin their attack, there's almost like two separate battles going on. The Athenians are locked in a hoplite on hoplite war where you have two like phalanx shield walls crashing into each other, and neither really has a significant advantage. And then the Persians fall on the Spartans. And we have this Spartan, of course, is like, I'm not retreating. Like, well, we're going to leave you then. And then the Persians see it. And so they all come rushing back. And there's just the amount of description around that battle is on just that moment parallels Thermopylae in a sense. The Spartans finally have success and kill Mardonius, who's he's leading not just the Persians, but he's leading this specific contingent of Persian infantry. And with his death, the rout begins. That also fulfills this like joking, riposte Xerxes had made when the Spartans sent a little envoy up and said, we need some satisfaction for the death of our king at Thermopylae. And Xerxes, of course, like, you can almost imagine him like spitting out his food or like spitting out his drink, laughing and saying like, well, they're going to get all the satisfaction they need from, my guy here, Mardonius. Like, he's going to annihilate you guys. So you look to him for your satisfaction. And of course, Xerxes' arrogance again falls. Mardonius had opportunities to not give battle, but he demands that glory. And there's a historical sense that Mardonius would have become like the satrap of Greece. He would have had like this enormous, crown jewel to add to the Persian Empire, despite Egypt being, a clear crown jewel, or the wealth of Lydia being in Sardis being a clear crown jewel. He really felt Greece would be that for him. And so he fights and he dies. Then after the success of the Greeks at the Battle of Platia, Pausanias and the Spartans come in and they see this enormous, magnificent tent, and they say, hey, prepare the meal you would make, for the king. Prepare what you would make for the Persian aristocracy. And they make this fabulous meal, and then he goes, okay, Spartans, like, make our dinner up. And they have these like crummy little bowls of broth and a little chunk of bread. And he thinks it's hysterical, and he talks about how like, wow, what fools are these Persians that they have all of this wealth and yet they come here to steal our poverty. Who do they think they are? A message that of course is reinforced by the final like page of the histories when Herodotus relates how Cyrus talks about, if you have all of the luxury and all of the pleasure, it makes the people soft and ultimately they'll be conquered. Whereas if you're rugged and you constantly have to survive and figure out ways to survive, you're able to persevere and find victory and triumph. We also have sort of the beginning of the new Ionian Revolt, which sort of closes two circles. There is the circle of the Greco-Persian Wars begin with the Ionian Revolt, infamously with like the message, tattooed on the slave's head and shaving the head off. Great secret code moment. so the Ionian Revolt sort of starts the Greco-Persian Wars, and this new Ionian Revolt occurs right at the end of the Greco-Persian Wars. But there's also this larger arc, which if you recall all the way back to the beginning of the month when we were talking about Book 1, it begins with Croesus and Lydia going in and subjugating the various Ionian city-states. And so there's sort of like two bits of closure that like have their new arc and have wheeled all the way around to the possibility of, Western Asia Minor or Turkey, modern Turkey, being freed from any type of subjugation. And of course, there's Tigranus, who is the last of the chaps Herodotus describes as being the tallest or best looking man. There have been a couple of these guys. They must have really been something. And then we close out, of course, with Cyrus at the end, but we also close out with sort of just what an absolute awful person Xerxes was. And Herodotus does not, and this again is a weird omission, Herodotus doesn't tell us how Xerxes ends, awful even though. But he does relate this really creepy bit where Xerxes wants to seduce his sister-in-law. She refuses him. He then comes up with a bizarre plan to have his niece from that sister-in-law and his brother marry his son Darius, who's the crown prince, but who never succeeds him. Marry Crown Prince Darius, and he then orders his son Darius and his daughter-in-law to have her commit adultery with him because he's the great king, and he becomes infatuated with her. When his wife gives him a robe, and his mistress, who's also his daughter-in-law, who's also his niece, we're in Game of Thrones territory here, demands that from him, it creates this bit where we see just what it means, like the misogyny of the Persian Empire and of nearly every nation, civilization in antiquity from the Bronze Age on, which is that Xerxes is the creep. He's the adulterer. He's the one who's committing all this. And yet it is the mother of his mistress, his sister-in-law, who refused his advances, who ends up being horribly tortured and murdered. However, what Herodotus doesn't tell us is that Xerxes later on was assassinated. And they spread rumors that it was his son, Crown Prince Darius, who had been behind the assassination, really in an effort to create instability. He is succeeded by Artaxerxes, who's a younger son of his, so things do not end well for Xerxes. Artaxerxes, incidentally, employs Themistocles, also not shared with Herodotus, but Themistocles is ostracized later on because of his arrogance. He engages in a lot of shenanigans. He's constantly collecting bribes. He's constantly covering his own backside. And so he ends up being ostracized. And that was an annual tradition in Athens where a person's name, they would have the ostracized shard of pottery. They would write a person's name on it, and whoever had a plurality of the names was exiled for, a year. Or I can't remember if it was exactly 1 year or a given amount of time. So it was a whole thing. And so Themistocles later on was ostracized, and realizing that he was going to get in trouble, he ends up fleeing to a couple of different places and ended up collecting a salary from the King of Kings of Persia, Artaxerxes. So that closes us out on Herodotus. So thanks for joining me. A couple of quick recommendations. If you want to know more about Salamis, there's a really good book called The Battle of Salamis by Barry Strauss. Highly recommend it. If you thought that Herodotus was an absolute liar, you're probably on board with Plutarch. And Plutarch's lives, a number of the Greek lives are actual Greek lives from, that are in Herodotus. Themistocles is there. Simon, who was not even really mentioned, but was involved, he's there. Cleomenes of Sparta, Leonidas. So there's a number of Greek lives in Plutarch that pop up. And of course, if you're sort of curious what happens next, well, the Peloponnesian War comes at, a generation and a half later. Pericles, who I think gets one mention as one of the Alcmaeonids from Athens, sort of this super aristocratic family. he becomes the key, like, dominating leader of Athens and leads them into a Peloponnesian War against Sparta. And Thucydides, of course, details that. Great book. Not as much fun, in my opinion, as Herodotus. Not as, like, weird and all over the place. Thucydides is on a mission. But thanks again for joining. Let me know what you think. Bye.